On January 8, 1968, then Private First Class Gary G. Wetzel was on duty and on board a helicopter near the province of Ap Dong, Vietnam. They were on an Eagle flight, named because of how they'd fly over an area waiting to catch something happening on the ground and then react to it. They had already made a few stops, dropping off their deadly cargo of 7 or 8 troops, scanning the area, scooping them up again and leaving. Nothing had happened so far until the first bad omen reared its head. While grounded at an old French fort to meet with a ground commander, a group of Australian helicopters joined them, a number of them shot nearly to pieces. After that, decisions were made by the higher-ups, and Wetzel was back on the helicopter as part of an insertion force of both American and Australian choppers. A short time later, Wetzel's helicopter was flying over the area of the airstrike, getting ready to open up its doors and let the machine gun rip. The standard procedure for a mission like this was to have more than one set of gunships closely staggered so they could cover each other. You can imagine how thick the tension felt in the hot Vietnamese air when Wetzel's helicopter was already starting to drop into the treetops, committing to the fight, and their backup was a quarter mile behind them. Wetzel states that this was the moment he realized the situation was a big goddamn mistake. Now 15 to 20 feet off the ground, a barrage of gunfire immediately erupted as numerous Viet Cong stood up from their hiding places, Wetzel describing it feeling like there must have been 8 million of them stood up. In an instant they were caught in a hailstorm of gunfire, and then came the rocket-propelled grenade. From ahead and left of the helicopter, the RPG made a direct hit, blowing out the front of the ship. What Wetzel did afterward was extraordinary, but the scenario he and the rest of the crew found themselves in was unfortunately very common. Right now, though, it was Wetzel and his crew that needed rescuing. After scraping to a halt on the ground and being lit up by withering crossfire, all in the span of a few seconds, 2 of the men were already dead. Snapping into action, Wetzel was determined to save as many as he could, and he decided to start by making sure his aircraft commander was safe. When he threw open the door separating them, his commander was in terrible shape, but alive. He and his crew chief managed to get the commander out of the devastated helicopter. Then disaster struck. And we got him about halfway up, and then Bart says duck, and then he goes like this, and I hear a bang. Before he knew what had happened, he was blown into a rice paddy by 2 enemy explosives that went off just inches from his location. His left arm, gone. Severe wounds in his right arm, chest, and left leg. Profuse bleeding. War is hell, and Wetzel was in the 9th circle of it. Despite all of this, he had no chance for hesitation. Looking over his left side, he spotted a VC gripping another grenade, his body betraying his intention to toss it right at Wetzel. One-armed yet single-minded, Wetzel whipped his Thompson around and zippered him up. The stunned VC fell back, his explosive going off and killing multiple hostiles clustered around him. More explosives went off. It was a spectacular, chaotic light show of lethality. It's like July 4th, but it's on the ground. And you don't get to see the colors, you don't get to say ooh and ah, you just shit in your pants. Wetzel and another man raced to their aircraft commander and put tourniquets on his legs, staunching the flow of blood. At that moment, Bart, the other conscious man, warned Wetzel that the Vietnamese were flooding the area and killing the wounded. Knowing his limits, knowing he couldn't take them all with brute force, Wetzel and the 2 other men opted to feign death. They certainly looked the part. Wetzel was missing an arm and sprawled out in muddy water, Bart with holes in his head and missing part of his jaw from shrapnel, the aircraft commander being so close to the light at the end of the tunnel he just rolled over. Wetzel heard footfalls, a boot stomped down in front of him, his one eye peeking out of the muddy water being the only sense he had of his surroundings. He's just waiting for the shot to come, making his peace, thinking the VC should just get it over with. The shot comes, but it goes through his foot. We can only speculate why the enemy would shoot Wetzel anywhere but the head, but what we do know is that he wouldn't live to know the error of his ways. Shots rang out, these now from Americans, and the VC hurried away. Wetzel figured he'd had enough rest and was ready for more action. He snatched his Thompson and crawled around the chopper. He saw the VC trying to unfix the machine gun from the helicopter, his machine gun, and raising up his Thompson, blew the 6 enemies off their feet and into their graves. Wetzel returned to his aircraft commander, who said one of the hardest things a man can hear, to tell his wife he loves her. I'm like, shut up, you tell her yourself, we'll get out of this shit. The anger started welling up inside Wetzel, but he didn't have time to cry, he reacted with action, with vengeance. He tucked his useless, mangled arm into his waistband to keep it from flopping around and did what he described as his John Wayne run, putting bursts of .45 caliber rounds into anyone in his way as he dashed for the helicopter. He took some shrapnel in the leg and went down on one knee, and the next thing he remembers was having miraculously staggered back to his original position in the helicopter's gunwale. Fueled by sheer willpower and making use of what little blood he had left running through his veins, he overcame the shock and racking pain of his injuries and pulled the trigger. At that moment his machine gun was the only weapon being used effectively against the enemy. Wetzel remained in place, pouring bullets onto the enemy weapons emplacement until they stopped firing back. There was no time to stop. Refusing to tend to his own grievous wounds, he attempted to return to the aid of his aircraft commander. Unfortunately, the body has its limits, and Wetzel's was long past the breaking point. Massive blood loss left him passed out on the ground. But not for long. Regaining consciousness, he snapped back into doing what he believed to be his duty, dragging himself to the aid of his fellow crewmen. After agonizing effort, he came to the side of the crew chief who was attempting to drag the wounded aircraft commander to a nearby dike, the safest place they could find. Amid all this, Wetzel passed out again, and again he pulled himself up to his feet, unwavering in his devotion to his brothers. He continued on, grabbing other wounded soldiers and pulling them across the rice paddy. It would be more than 10 hours before reinforcements would begin to evacuate the wounded. Wetzel survived, but his left arm had to be amputated. After 6 months in the hospital, he made his transition back into civilian life. While working as an expediter in Wisconsin sometime later, he had some unusual guests show up to his workplace. A colonel, a major, and a first sergeant all had a message to deliver. He'd be going on a trip soon. At the time Wetzel brushed it off. He'd already gotten some medals and didn't think this request was for anything important. After 2 weeks of prodding by the officers, he relented and agreed to the trip. That flight ended up taking him to the White House to receive the Medal of Honor from President Lyndon Johnson. When asked what the medal meant to him, Wetzel replied, "When I was in the Tokyo hospital, where the doctors took out more than 400 stitches, some of the guys I pulled out who were recovering from their wounds found out I was there. They would walk up to my bed and ask, 'Are you Gary Wetzel?' And I'd say, 'Yeah,' and they would pull out pictures of their wives, kids, or girlfriends and say, 'Hey, man, because of you, this is what I've got to go back to.'" Wetzel would reply, "I'm not Superman. I was just a guy doing his job." To read this full story and the heart-stopping stories of over 30 of the greatest war heroes, please check out the paperback and ebook, Giant Killers, War Heroes and Special Forces Legends.
Available now on Amazon.